All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Fearcast. This is the podcast dedicated to OCD and anxiety spectrum disorders and getting your life back. I'm your host, Kevin Foss, and I'm a licensed therapist specializing in OCD and anxiety disorders. Thank you all so much for joining me for this podcast. This is an exciting podcast. I think in general, but that's a side point. I think this particular episode is exciting and exceptionally nerdy. So if you are of the nerdy persuasion, enjoy talking about OCD and enjoy talking about numbers and research, this is your episode. So if you're not into those things, I still think it's going to be an interesting chat, and it'd be worth hanging out just to learn a little bit more about OCD, about the work that's being done in OCD land to try to better understand the disorder, its manifestation, how it impacts people across the country. So I think it's worth it. So for those of you who are listening to this, actually, before I even get into that, so this is typically a question and answer based podcast, if y'all don't know. If you have a question, go over to fearcastpodcast.com. You can send me a message there by clicking on the submit a question link. The news to that, by the way, is you can click on, there's a little button now that says record your question. So you can press that button. You're going to have to give your web browser permissions to use your microphone, etc. But record your audio question and it will get sent directly into me, and that will go up on the next episode. Since putting that up, I've already gotten one, so that's going to go up next after this episode. So if you want your question answered as quickly as possible, send it in audio. You can do that over there. Of course, you can also send me the regular text message. You can also, of course, go over to Instagram. I'm Fearcast Podcast over there, and you can send in your question. Just go over to the DMs, click on the little microphone button in the DM section. You can record your audio question there. Those also get sent up. If you don't want to download Instagram, go over to Fearcast Podcast. You can also just record it onto your phone and email it to me at questions@fearcastpodcast.com. Any way you want to do it, this is a question and answer based podcast. Except for today. Today, I guess I asked the question. Well, no. More appropriately, Dr. Pinciotti, Caitlin Pinciotti, asked this question, and then she went about researching it and getting thousands and thousands and thousands of people trying to answer this question and giving data and helping to answer a question. So this is ultimately how research works. But so let me go. So let me get into this. So today is going to be about the National OCD Survey. So what's exciting about this is that Dr. Pinciotti was wondering, like, how is OCD different across the country? How does it manifest amongst different sort of populations, different types of people? OCD isn't, and America is not this homogenous nation, as we'll talk about. So Dr. Pinciotti, after having done a bunch of research and gathering information, has put together some maps and some ideas about how OCD shows up. And lucky for us, Jon Hershfield was willing to jump on and also chat about this research. But let me tell you a little bit about this, I'll just get into this. So when I first learned about this and why I wanted to have this on, Dr. Pinciotti was sharing this at the OCD conference. And I reached out to her and said, hey, this would be really great to have on the podcast. So we chatted a little bit prior to recording, and just so she can, explain a little bit more and help me understand a little bit. And one of the things she didn't run in this, so we didn't get a chance to really talk about it, and she didn't present it at the conference, was my question about harm OCD and how that shows up and where that's showing up across the country. So she didn't run that, and so she decided to run those numbers. My question was whether or not it's kind of the great equalizer, right? It's not worth noting because, well, harm is something that everybody worries about. So it's probably not going to show up significantly in specific areas of the country due to that region's kind of values. And again, you'll get more into this as things go on. But she ran the numbers, and after we recorded our podcast, she sent me the results of this. So I don't have maps for this to show. And what I was going to say earlier is, if you're listening to this on an audio, or if you're listening to this through podcast or wherever you're listening to it, just through audio, you're going to be missing out on some of the data. So I'm going to be putting up, if you go over to YouTube, I'm going to be showing some of the data slides and some of the maps and kind of the regions that highlight or the highlighted regions of what we're talking about. So it'll be a little clearer and I think a little bit more helpful to understanding what we're talking about. But hopefully we also describe it well enough so that if you're just listening on a podcast, it won't be too wildly confusing. But let me get into this. So I'm going to be boring and read from emails. But what she found was that indeed harm OCD is actually showing up significantly in one area, and also what she looked at is where it shows up significantly less. So she found that it shows up significantly in what's called the far west. What were her numbers? So the numbers that she pointed out were, harm or impulsive or aggressive type of harm shows up 1.5 times more likely in an area known as the far west. So you'll see a map of this, and it's kind of, when you think of the Wild West area, it's kind of like that, right? So kind of western part of America, but not quite all the way on the coast. That'll be a section called the left coast, and we'll talk more about that. So it shows up 1.5 more times likely there, and 34% less in a section called the Spanish Caribbean, which is kind of like the bottom tip of Florida. And she also noted that accidental harm shows up 1.9, so almost 2 times more likely in an area called New Netherland, which is kind of like the kind of greater New York area, and also 1.6 times more likely in that far west area. And 36% less in the New Caribbean area, and 49% less in an area called New France. You will hear us badmouth New France. New France is like southern Louisiana, just like specifically that area. We're going to sass it, not badmouth it. We're going to sass it a little bit, and you'll hear why. But so it's interesting that it pops up in that area. Jon jumped on in that and said, it's interesting because his theory is harm OCD is more prevalent in these areas because the culture is based on adapting to danger, either from environmental elements or from the integrational trauma of pioneer culture. So a lot of these areas that she maps on, and again, we'll explain it further, is based on just the way America was colonized, the way it was kind of explored, taken over, and the migration of people into certain regions, and why those values or why particular values are really fostered, cultivated, and just entrenched in those areas. Dr. Pinciotti then jumps on, and she said she was thinking something similar. The land was settled, quote, settled, and continues to be occupied by people doing extremely dangerous manual labor jobs, railroad, mining, oil, factories. And there's a frontier mentality of toughness and survival against the elements, including against fellow humans who are often seen as a threat. Maybe this is not only the environmental danger, but also the occupational danger that puts harm at the forefront. Because to be harmed could mean that to lose your self-reliance and not be able to survive. So there's going to be a lot, and then she goes on to say, you'd be right about New France. So I am right about New France in my assumption that New France just doesn't care about anything. And again, you'll hear more about this. So let me just tell you a little bit about Dr. Pinciotti and Jon Hershfield. So Dr. Caitlin Pinciotti is an associate professor in psychiatry and behavioral sciences with Baylor College of Medicine, as well as being a licensed clinical psychologist. Her research primarily focuses on OCD, PTSD, trauma, and how these interact to impact the severity, presentation, and responsiveness to cognitive behavioral therapy. Jon Hershfield is a licensed therapist and director of the Center for OCD and Anxiety with Sheppard Pratt. Jon is also a member of the Scientific and Clinical Advisory Board to the International OCD Foundation and is on the faculty of the IOCDF's Behavioral Therapy Training Institute. Jon has authored 6 books on OCD and is a regular speaker at mental health conferences worldwide. So if you want to add your voice, and Dr. Pinciotti is actually asking for people, particularly in the New France, so southern Louisiana area, or the, I mess this up every single time. Spanish Caribbean. so the southern tip of Florida, if you are in those areas or know someone in those areas that has OCD and would be willing to share their story, and again, I think the survey only takes about 10 minutes, so it shouldn't be much. But if they'd be willing to add their voice to it and their experience, it'll really help Dr. Pinciotti's research and further our understanding of OCD as we move forward. So if you're interested in it, you can email her at National OCD Survey at bcm.edu. Again, National OCD Survey at bcm.edu. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, I'll put a link somewhere underneath in the episode description. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Dr. Pinciotti and Jon Hershfield. All right, everybody, thank you so much for joining us for today. I want to welcome Dr. Caitlin Pinciotti and Jon Hershfield for joining us for the podcast today. Thank you all for the real experts to come on who know how to pronounce names and places and have read books and are just generally great people. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Oh man. So I wanted to have these two great folks on to talk about this study that Dr. Pinciotti put on, where she did some research, and I'll let her discuss more details about what the purpose of it is and why this research is important. But just wanted to look into some of the differences in the way OCD manifests across the country, and whether or not there can be things found from one area to another that would illustrate how or why or when or in what ways OCD manifests and how it would be different. So I'll let Dr. Caitlin Pinciotti explain things that I just clearly can't.
Well, that was actually a really good idea. So the study is the National OCD Survey, which I'm hoping that as people are listening, maybe that sounds familiar to them, and that means I've been doing my job with harassing people far and wide to participate in this study. But the goal really was to see, to what extent does OCD manifest differently across the United States. I think, as OCD clinicians, we all sort of have these maybe assumptions or clinical experiences that suggest that certain OCD themes might cluster in certain parts of the country, but no one's ever actually sort of taken to the research to see if that really bears out on a larger scale. And so that was the sort of main aim of the National OCD Survey. There's a couple other sub-aims that we don't have to get into. But we've been collecting data since August of 2023. So it's officially been 2 full years of data collection. We still are collecting it. I'll plug that here. We're still looking for folks, especially in a couple regions, which we'll get into in a moment. But we've had around probably 3,000, this is adults with OCD across the United States who've participated at this point. And it's been really amazing. So, as it relates to our conversation, other than sort of getting people in the door and taking the survey, which is obviously a huge undertaking, the other question was, how do we divide the United States? There's no kind of official way that we, divide different regions. And so something that was fun was having to dig into that kind of sociology of like, how do you slice and dice the US? Because, for example, the Midwest is just this sort of like vast, like so many cultures comprised of what we call the Midwest. And so, we'll obviously get into that, but we ended up using a really fun framework for that.
That's awesome. And by the way, for anybody who's interested in this, so Dr. Pinciotti was talking about how you got all these people signing up. If you're interested in signing up, the test only takes, or the survey only takes about 10 minutes, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you have nothing better to do, if you're in the bathroom and you got nothing better to do, sign up, go for it. I think we need more and more information, as we'll talk about why that is. So you talked about the framework, and was that too much? That was too much.
Why are you in the bathroom with nothing better to do than research?
I'm sorry, I'm the only person on their phone in the bathroom.
No, I'm just saying you could be making memes or looking up recipes.
Valid point. Valid point. This is also important to give back to the general body. All right, I'm not going to get into this. All right, so point is, all right, so it's interesting to get all this information, and then you kind of talked about, yeah, like the regions of America are very, very different. And, it's not like, unfortunately, as it turns out, the United States is not this homogenous group. It is very different. So, how did you guys come up with kind of the framework for why or how to break that up and how to see the differences or to kind of frame that?
Yeah, so we wanted something that was more nuanced than, red versus blue states or north versus south. We wanted something that better captured the cultures of the regions beyond just, I think how we traditionally think of like voting patterns and things. And we wanted this to be something that had some evidence backing too. And so we ended up using a book that was written by Colin Woodard. It's called American Nations, A History of the 11 Rival Regional Cultures of North America. It came out in, I think, 2010 or 2011. And Colin Woodard is, he's a historian and a researcher. And, his angle is essentially that the United States has never really been united in terms of culture, that there's always been these sort of subcultures or what he calls nations within our nation. And that no matter how many hundreds of years have passed, that the values, the belief systems have really become really ingrained in those regions, so that, whoever settled in one region hundreds of years ago, like those beliefs and their sort of approach to community and religion and culture are still very pervasive to this day. And so we use his framework for those 11 nations to really start to dig in and see how does OCD manifest differently across these 11 nations.
Right. So what were some of the ways that you then broke this down to try to pull out better question. As you started to do this research, or what prompted this research? I think that's a better initial question.
Yeah. Well, I think for one thing, I got really excited about this idea, and then I was like, let's do it. And I work with Eric Storch, and he was like, yeah, let's do it. And, here we are like 2 years later, like this was a lot of work. And it's not grant funded. So this has all been like, labor that we've put towards this. And similarly that people have participated in without being paid, which we super appreciate and is why we kept it so short. Oh man, I already forgot what your question was.
But I have a related question. Like, how much psychological research in general is done by asking Eric Storch and him saying, yeah, let's do it? Because I feel like
a lot. Yes, I brought a lot of ideas to him, and he's like, cool, let's do it.
This also sounds like a conversation that happened like late after one of the conferences and just going like, why don't we do this? And he goes, yeah. And here we are 2 years later.
Here we are.
I actually think this subject, that there's a lot more to continue to explore in it, because there's, as clinicians, we get a lot of training in things like cultural diversity, and a lot of that is filtered through specific lenses. I'm not saying good or bad, but specific lenses. So color or religion or one's abilities or oppressor narratives and things like that. And this was interesting about this study is it's sort of like on a completely different wavelength. It's like what are the trends across these different regions Because I think to your point, Dr. Pinciotti, that it's like we like to think of the United States being one way or another, but then we always say like, oh, well, those states and these states, they're like this and they're like that. And the truth is, it's sort of a little bit of both, which is we are all over the place, values wise. And if you're a clinician, you're not actually thinking about your patient's values or the value tradition that they come from.
Mm-hmm.
I think you miss something very important about their OCD. And we talk about OCD not being about the content, but we also talk about OCD going after what you care about the most. And so understanding why somebody cares about something as much as they do, really helps you be a good clinician, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And that's such a great point, because, to the extent that there are these regional differences, it's not because there's like something in the water somewhere, right? It's that like inherent in that is that there are these cultures that OCD could then latch onto in some way.
Right. So, to Jon's point, when I first heard about this study, my biggest question was not only just what are the differences that you found and why those differences are there, but what can we as clinicians do with this information that would be particularly helpful in meeting with our clients? And I was curious if and maybe I'm jumping the gun on this question before we get into some of the differences, but how can we use this information clinically?
Well, I'll just say when you, and then I'm curious to hear what Jon has to share about this too. This question is so important, and it also reminds me of doing research when like something is just like, you just think it's like really fun and really interesting, and you want to publish it because it's just like, this is cool to just know this, and then you inevitably get that reviewer, usually reviewer number 2, who's like, well, what does this mean clinically? And you're like, well, can't this just be cool? Like,
and yes, the answer to that is yes. This can absolutely just simply be cool and interesting, and noticing those differences. And I asked that question also knowing it is a fool's errand for us to try to put everybody into a box and say, well, you're from the Midlands, so you're like this. Right? Or to say, you're from the Deep South, so obviously you're dealing with scrupulosity and in this specific way, and therefore treatment should be done this way. But is there, so, it's silly for us to try to narrow down exactly what to do, but maybe I think to perhaps to Jon's point a little bit, widening our view of maybe how this culture, or how the culture in which they grew up or live or are, to a certain degree indoctrinated in or by, can influence the way that their OCD manifests, and the way that they just view the world around them is going to influence how we approach them and how we think about treatment with this person, what we say, what we don't say, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think it's about asking questions, not just making assumptions about people, but if you know that a person is from a certain region, you have some sense that there are certain core values that are, statistically connected to that region through the research, then you might have the question. You might not even ask the question out loud. It might just be a question in your head, like, I wonder if this person is influenced in this way or that way. Again, in the same way that if you really knew someone was a religious person of a specific faith, you'd be asking questions like, how does the person's faith play into their concept of their moral scrupulosity, or what it means to be clean, or what it means to have completed a prayer or something like that. And so I think I think it enhances our listening skills, not just because you're right. Anybody could fall prey to like, oh, well, you're from this state, so you're probably like that. I don't think that's the lesson to learn from a study like this. I think it's more of like, it keeps us on our toes. It keeps us wondering, is there some way I can help really connect with this person's pain as it relates to the sort of gravitational pull of their OCD content?
Right. Yeah, I like to think of it as like sort of deepening our conceptualization to the extent that it may be relevant for someone. So perhaps the underlying function of, some OCD theme and associated compulsions might be a little bit different in one region versus another if it's latched onto a certain sort of belief system. And of course, I was ragging on, well, mostly myself, because it's an important question. Like, all research should have some sort of clinical relevance, right? It's a good reminder. Like, it's not enough for it to just be cool. But I do think that there's ways that we can really deepen our understanding of how people as a whole person, has arrived at the person that they are, and how we can best help them.
Absolutely, and I have a couple of questions to go on with that, but I'd love to maybe go through some of these specifically. I know we're probably not going to have time in the hour that we have, or the whatever we have left, to go over the specific cultural differences of the cultural areas. But if anybody's interested, and I can try to put up some of the maps or information from this book, but it's throughout the book it kind of goes through these specific regions, and I think Jon may be able to speak more eloquently to this of the specific areas of the country that developed in certain ways and for specific reasons, and then why those then areas continue to share those similar values as time has gone by. And it's really interesting that it's not just blocks of areas. I mean, some of the areas that like the Midlands, I think, is this just weird shape of an area that doesn't. It seems like it doesn't make sense when you think of the Midwest. You think of maybe just a big circle, I don't know, surrounding Wisconsin, right? But it's this very odd shape. And furthermore, like the Deep South, it goes not just in what you might think of the South, it goes all the way down into Texas in a very odd direction. So it's interesting to see how that plays out. But I think it'd be worth it to go through some of the different subtypes and to see what you came up with, or what the research showed, not what you came up with, like you found it or you made it happen, but what you discovered from the survey, and just kind of what stuck out to you, what was interesting in what commonalities there were in certain areas, what was more popular, and what was less popular in certain areas.
I want to just, before we jump into that, we talk about the strange shapes of these regions, but they're actually those shapes for a reason. It wasn't, it would be easy to kind of look at the map and be like, okay, these people are here, these people are here. Well, let's just call everything in this section that we don't have a name for this thing. But like the Midlands, for example, essentially started with Quakers and Quaker culture in the area where I am right now, Northern Maryland, Pennsylvania, that area. And, they had this tendency to just kind of gradually move west, like a lot of people, and bring their culture with them. So if you look at it on a map, it's this weird kind of elongated kind of, thing in the middle of the country that like looks like a bunch of people started walking to the left and then eventually stopped. Because that's how kind of the memetics of it,
the migration of people,
transmission of values from generation to generation really kind of traveled in that direction.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add to that too is and you pointed this out, Jon, during our IOCF panel, that not only does this have kind of a historic precedent and sort of explanation for how people got where they were, but this continues to bear out in research on voting patterns, on personality traits. I even saw something that was entirely unrelated to this online over the weekend that was like a map of different sort of like ethnic kind of heritages, like lineages across the country. And I mean, I laughed because the map almost looked exactly like Woodard's map. And so yeah, I think that's a good thing as you're, kind of sharing information about this, is this really is grounded in something very real.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So one of the things that Dr. Pinciotti, you initially had talked about was, I think you said, as you were doing this study and you gathered all this information, one of the first things you really wanted to test to see if this study was shaped as you would expect it to. And I think this goes to exactly what this study's about. Let me get to my map here. Was looking at religious scrupulosity. So religious scrupulosity, I suppose, for those of you who are not initiated into this information, is OCD about one's faith. So is that accurate? Okay, I hope I get that right. Okay, thank goodness. They haven't shut me down yet. All right, so religious scrupulosity. So theoretically, you would say, well, one of the most religious parts of the country is going to be the South in that big general area. So theoretically, if OCD grabs onto that which we value the most and care about the most and is most important to us, one would think that in the South, where religion is quite central to a lot of people, that would pop up as something where OCD might want to grab onto it more. So, Dr. Pinciotti, could you go a little bit into that map and what you noticed?
That was a fun, if I can sound like a complete nerd, like a fun moment for me, because there was, anytime you collect data, you think something, but you could be totally wrong. You could find nothing, and then it's like, what do you make of nothing? And so it was kind of a complex statistical approach, and first time using these maps. And so I was like, let me do religious group, because this is the one really that inspired this study, was this belief that religious group is more prevalent in the South. And so I plugged that one in, and sure enough, the map lit up. Religious group is indeed, it's a 1.7 times more prevalent in the areas that are termed the Deep South and Greater Appalachia, which maps perfectly onto, what you might call like the Bible Belt, and sort of the regions where religion really is like a foremost part of the culture. What's interesting too, and I wasn't necessarily expecting this, but I think this also makes a lot of sense, is it also lights up when there are regions where if you live there, you're a lot less likely to have this particular theme. And the two regions that lit up are what's called the left coast, which like really hugs, like it is what it says, like hugs really the West Coast, like along the ocean, from like middle of California all the way up north. And then New Netherland, which is essentially greater New York City area. And so folks living in New York City and this kind of really far left coast are significantly less likely to struggle with religious group compared to people who live in other parts of the country.
Yeah, it's really interesting that it would pop up in that way. And it was also interesting that we talked a little bit about this, or actually, I know, Jon, one of your favorite things to talk about is moral scrupulosity, because there's a big overlap there with moral scrupulosity in Greater Appalachia and kind of the Midlands area. Could you speak a little bit about that overlap, and how it's interesting then that moral scrupulosity doesn't match up as neatly as religious scrupulosity is? The Deep South is kind of left out of that area.
Yeah, I mean, my observation, sort of digging a little bit deeper into this, really has to do with, like I mentioned before, the Midlands area, which would be the kind of Pennsylvania, Northern Maryland, where I was born and raised, is very much focused on Quaker ideals and being pluralistic and having religious freedom, diversity, coexistence. Like those are at the core of the belief systems. Even this building I'm in right now, I'm at Shepherd Pratt, was founded by Quakers with this idea in mind of to meet a need, everybody, to treat people like equals. This is kind of a radical idea in the 1800s, So it kind of makes sense to me that even though these were profoundly religious people, their focus was very much on pluralism and bringing people together and having compassion for others. And so you can imagine a susceptible person with OCD spending a lot of time worrying about, wait, what was I welcoming? Was I open to this person? Was I compassionate enough to this person? Did I have the right intentions in interacting with this person in a way that transcends, what does my religious faith specifically say, in the Bible or the Quran or wherever about what I'm specifically supposed to do, or am I praying correctly? We often lump religious and moral scrupulosity together because they use the same word, but religious scrupulosity is a big, very much connected to OCD, whereas moral scrupulosity is also connected to OCD, but you also find it in a lot of other conditions, trauma, ASD, and things like that. There's a lot of ways people arrive at moral scrupulosity that they don't arrive at religious scrupulosity. Yeah. But I think that cultural shift in that area of the Midlands, is probably related to why we would see much more religious scrupulosity in the Deep South than in this area. Right.
Dr. Pinciotti, any further thoughts on kind of the moral scrupulosity map?
I do, yeah. So in addition to moral scrup being more prevalent in the Midlands, it was also more prevalent in New Netherland, again, that greater New York City region. I think this is really fascinating. And again, this speaks to your first question, which is you didn't ask it this aggressively, but why should we care about this, right? Because I think, it
was pretty aggressive. It was more aggressive than I wanted it to be. I apologize.
It hurt my feelings. But
well, this will be our last conversation, I guess. It was good chatting with you.
But I think that OCD in some cases, if you're surrounded by something, then OCD can latch onto it. But I think also there are other cases where if you're not surrounded by something, OCD latches onto it. And I think it's not always in one direction or the other in terms of what role does exposure play, not in the ERP sense, but of just like going about the world. And so what I thought was really interesting about this New Netherland finding, having Morrell's group for people who live in greater New York City, is to sort of piggyback on some of the other research that's been done with these nations that I wasn't at all involved in. They had people take a personality inventory, and they use this personality inventory to sort of characterize the personality traits of these regions. And one of the things that they did that was kind of fun was they pulled out of the personality inventory what was the item that was most characteristic of each region, just as like an example of like, this is what people from this region were most likely to endorse compared to people from anywhere else. And the item that was highlighted for New Netherland was, when I'm given extra change from like a cashier, I return it. But it was in the opposite direction, meaning that people who live in greater New York City were the least likely of anyone in the country to return extra change. And so, you know, my curiosity about this is, you know, is it possible that folks with OCD who are living in this region perhaps see this kind of, you know, maybe for lack of a better term, like immoral behavior around them, or sort of low standards for like morality, and their OCD latches on, like, I don't want to be that way, right? So I have to take extra precaution to make sure that I'm overly nice, that I return my change, that I apologize and over-explain and whatever it might be.
Yeah. It's an interesting kind of thing to note, that for some it would be, you know, OCD would latch onto it because this value is particularly high in this area, or it's particularly low, and why is it that it would manifest in that certain way? So I think that goes against that idea that, oh, we can lump everybody in, and this area is going to manifest because this is really important to these folks. Well, it may be the opposite of that. I mean, to kind of move on as well to the sexual orientation obsessions. I had another question about this, but in this map, it shows it particularly high in the New Netherlands area, in the Spanish Caribbean, which is kind of like halfway down in Florida, all the way to the end of Florida, right? So it's particularly high in those areas, but then low in Tidewater, New France kind of being New Orleans, you know, southern Louisiana, and then the left coast. What are your thoughts on why it would manifest in this way?
Well, first, let me, and this will be sort of like the annoying asterisk that like the researcher always has to couch everything. So something that will come up in our conversation a lot is that New France, that southern Louisiana, including New Orleans, and Spanish Caribbean, that southern tip of Florida, those light up a lot. And one thing I want to just couch this with, which speaks to my earlier comment about how we're still recruiting folks, is those are the two regions where we've had the fewest number of people participating. They're really small regions, and so I think it's mostly just it's hard to get folks in. But for example, when I analyzed this data, I think we had maybe like 25 people in New France and maybe 35 in Spanish Caribbean. And so if you live there and you have OCD, or you know someone who does, please consider participating so we can get more reliable data. And so anyway, I wanted to sort of couch that as like, as we're at New France and Spanish Caribbean, it could just be kind of an artifact of like having such a small number of people really like inflating scores. But nonetheless, you know, I think what's more reliable are this New Netherland, Tidewater, and left coast outcomes. And I have to say, and I'd love to hear if Jon has thoughts with this. I was surprised that sexual orientation obsessions were less prevalent on the left coast. But I was not surprised that they were more prevalent in New Netherland, the greater New York City, because I was sort of envisioning this as, you know, perhaps something that might be more prevalent among people who are more liberal leaning. And so I sort of anticipated that those kind of liberal, like urban centers would light up. But I also expected that the Deep South would have more sexual orientation obsessions, and it didn't. There's no difference. So yeah, I don't know if Jon.
Well, I have a couple of data points that might be worth considering. I mean, one is I've worked with plenty of profoundly religious people who will tell me that they don't have sexual orientation obsessions because sexual orientation is not a thing, and everybody's heterosexual and everybody knows that, and my religion teaches me there's no such thing as gay, and so I just don't think about it. And weirdly, that kind of works for them because they don't actually spend enough time thinking about it to become truly obsessed with it. They might have some distorted beliefs about it or a lack of information about it, but it's almost a protective factor for them. It's like, I'm not even going to go there because my religion teaches me that's not even a thing. Another related phenomenon is, like you sort of mentioned, it's like high morals group in New York, in the New Netherlands area, based on this idea that maybe people are afraid of being like what they see, and they see a lot of immoral behavior. But then high religious group in the Deep South, where they're seeing a lot of religious behavior, right? So it's with OCD only being 2 to 3% of the population, it's very hard, I think. I think there's more research to be done to try to determine, is this a reaction to the environment or is this an alignment with the environment?
Right. Right. Yeah, and something that I want to add to that I think is so fascinating, specifically about sexual orientation OCD, is, when this was first being talked about, they used the term like homosexual OCD, and it was very much characterized as a fear of being gay. And it largely presented that way because, early on there were all of these really negative consequences and connotations with being gay. And so it makes sense that what was being described was straight people who were afraid that they might be gay. And it was kind of this fear base. Whereas, and I should say, and the research sort of bore that out too. It was like, males, like straight males, were sort of, this was more prevalent among them. I dug into this in this data set. And this is sort of like kind of an update now on how I think SO-OCD largely presents, because I actually found no significant difference in straight versus queer people endorsing these obsessions. And so I see this as sort of like this trajectory of, as our culture has become more accepting of different sexual orientations, obviously with the caveat of things that are currently happening. But as our culture has become more accepting, it's been less of a fear presentation for most. And I think a lot more people just having that doubt of like, I just don't know if I'm this or I'm that. It's not necessarily that one would be bad or one would be good. I just feel like I need to sort of figure it out before I can proceed. And so I thought that was really interesting, that now both straight and queer people are sort of equally as likely to endorse these. And I also found people in this sample who endorse sexual orientation obsessions were younger, and had more conservative caregivers growing up. So sort of like a little bit of nuance to that too, of but then exactly like Jon said, then I think that's where you do get some of those like perhaps regional differences, cultural differences about, are there still pockets where there is more of a fear associated instead of just kind of the doubt?
Well, it raises interesting questions too about OCD in general and how much of it is a fear of something or a doubt about something or some combination of the two. So what we're calling OCD also isn't exactly a monolith, so that makes it further challenging.
Yeah.
I think with that theme as well, when I'm working with someone with sexual orientation obsessions, I kind of look at what is the thing that you're afraid of underneath that. And I think to your point, Dr. Pinciotti, I find it's almost this fear of like, what if I just don't really know myself, or if I don't really know everything about myth
that obsession in a way.
Yeah, exactly. So it kind of goes in that direction. So it's far less about who someone is interested or not interested in. It's more about, do I truly know myself, and kind of looking at that theme, or the theme that's under the subtype.
Yeah, definitely.
I had that similar question, or maybe I don't know how we talked about this, but when it came to I think it was contamination obsessions. If we go further down, the contamination obsessions really jumped up high in Greater Appalachia. So am I saying that right? Appalachia. I'm listening to a lot of bluegrass right now, so a lot of people are saying Appalachia. So
I'm curious, Jon, how you say it, because I think I've done it both ways, and I also am like never quite sure that I'm serious.
It's like the Caribbean. It's the
I
Caribbean.
call that Appalachia. I also say scary movies I describe as horror movies. It's the same as in sorrow or borrow, but most people west of where I grew up say horror, like
Well, there's an O in it.
yeah. But tomorrow, sorrow, right? If you're in Canada, you'd be saying, sorry, right? And then so you would say horror, right? So these distinctions are also regional. I don't know if you guys remember the New York Times, regional accent thing where you could take this test online and it would tell you, like, do you call this a semi or an 18-wheeler, or do you call it a roundabout or a turnstile? And it'll tell you where you're from. And amazingly, it told me I was either from Baltimore or New York. Both my parents are from New York. And so it was like really kind of fascinating how accurate it was. And so I guess I think we're seeing sort of similar phenomenon here in this research, which is, yes, there's these distinct nations, but people are also influenced by, who their parents are. And so it's not just language, right? But it's also values, like what you gravitate towards, what you're, averse to. Fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
I don't remember what the question was, but fascinating stuff.
That language test that you mentioned has caused like so much division within my family, like in terms of, because some of the questions are like, do you call it this or do you call it that? And sometimes the answer is, I don't have a term for this. And it's like mind-boggling.
Mm-hmm.
Wait, you call it that? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
It's the soda and pop distinction, or if you're in California, it's is the freeway the I-5 or is it the 5? That's a strong distinction.
Well, the whole that article is a Californian thing. We don't talk about the 83 over here in Baltimore.
But Northern California, it's I-5. And there's this somewhere in California, there's a dividing line. So having been I grew up in Southern California, I went to undergrad in Northern California. That is the discussion to have in the dorms amongst everybody. So this is the exciting stuff that freshmen talk about. Anyhow, so it turns out people is different. I think that's what we're getting at here. My main question was about the contamination obsession, and why is it that in Greater Appalachia, they are more concerned about contamination? And again, New France, I picked on New France in our emails, is because they don't care about anything except for getting old.
So I was here about the contamination part, and it's based largely on probably me not knowing that area very well. But there's this kind of association, it's called a cultural association, with people in that area being very rural and being thought of as unclean. I'm not saying that they are, but being thought of by other areas as like an unclean region. And having worked with people from different countries where a similar dynamic might be at play, where if you could be from a country, if you're from a wealthy class, your kind of attitude about things are much different than if you're from a poorer class, and you're going to have a lot more attention to things like taking your shoes off when you enter the home. If you're from a poorer class, well, that would be considered sort of low class, and you wouldn't want to be seen that way. And so I wonder if part of what the phenomenon is with contamination there is this kind of cultural response to not wanting to be perceived as, lacking hygiene or being lower class, like that. Made up theory on the spot, but worth looking into.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
I had a very different theory about it, but I'm happy to be wrong about it. There's a lot of overlap between contamination and the moral group area. And one of the things that we sometimes see with contamination is this concern about, am I going to get sick or dirty and then make somebody else sick or infect somebody else with something? I wonder if there's a morality component to it, that they're more concerned about trying to get dirty so they don't affect somebody else. I wonder if there's an overlap with that, but I'll let Dr. Pinciotti bear that out.
You raise good questions about things like vaccines and spreading of illness and things like that, and what might be on people's minds in a rural or nomadic, culture.
Yeah, I think those are both really interesting points. Something actually, I know I'm sort of breaking my own rule because I said, like, let's not overinterpret New France and Spanish.
No, let's go ahead and do that.
But yeah, you know what?
There's only like 17 of them. Who cares? What are they going to do?
Throw caution to the wind. What stood out to me specifically about contamination is, of all the themes I looked at, this one had the strongest effect. And so, in Greater Appalachia, people are almost 2 times more likely to have contamination than in other parts of the country. If you live in New France, you're 71% less likely to struggle with contamination. at least if you're one of like the 25 people that took my survey. And this really surprised me because something I'm actually working on now is in the wake of Hurricane Helene, looking at how contamination, and particularly mental contamination, may sort of, spike after a hurricane, after a natural disaster, and potentially sort of linger for a while. Because and I was just over the weekend, I was watching a documentary about Katrina. It's 20 years since Hurricane Katrina as of later this week. If you think about the contamination that's associated with being part of a major hurricane, floodwaters, your belongings, it would make sense that someone would feel this lingering sense of disgust, or a sense of their things or their person being contaminated long after. And so I sort of had this working theory that perhaps the regions of the country that are susceptible to hurricanes, and especially New France, which includes New Orleans, where they're still really in some ways impacted by Katrina, that maybe I would have seen that pattern. And I was surprised to see that not only was I wrong about it being more prevalent, but again, this is the strongest affecting 71% less likely. I mean, whoever those 25 folks are who are in that region, that's really strong.
And it was very low in Morals Group as well, right? That same region?
Yes.
Yeah, bunch of dirty, unscrupulous people.
That's
That's
what they're
Bourbon
about.
Street is, right?
Again, I would look at how was that region, founded, and on what ideals and from what history, right? It was what were the attitudes of the French libertines who took over that place?
Because they're also significantly less likely to have racism obsessions too.
Mm-hmm.
So I had that curiosity about that area. If it's just since it seems to be a very diverse population, a lot of different types of people, different mindsets, different cultures, all mashed up together. If there's not a whole lot of room for prejudice, I say that, and I'm sure someone's going to be like, well, but that there's not a whole lot of room for it since you're exposed to so much. The stigma is far less in those areas, except for old people. They don't have old people.
That's right. High fear of aging, right?
Except for aging, right?
Yeah. Well, so when the first time I ever went to New Orleans, and by the way, I just adore New Orleans, and so I know you're picking on them, but I think
lovingly, it's one of the top places I want to go.
You should.
I've yet to go. I don't travel much. Go ahead. All right.
So speaking of, actually, one of the things they say when you travel there is to wear closed-toed shoes when you're walking around the French Quarter. You learn it the hard way if you don't. So when I was in New Orleans the first time, I was there for an interview, and I remember someone talking about the experience of like moving to New Orleans, having been raised somewhere else, and she said, it's totally normal to go to the grocery store on like noon on a Sunday and someone's like wearing a crown and a cape, and it just is what it is. Like no one sees that person as being like, is that person okay? Or like, what's the deal with that? It's just like, yeah, like go
They're
you.
fine. That's
Yeah.
fine.
And so there is really this like, there's this tolerance, almost like acceptance. Like it's part of who they are to just like not care about these things. And so it's kind of fun that has played out in the OCD themes too.
And I wonder too, with the constant threat of hurricanes and things like that, I wonder how that ties into maybe almost like a fatalistic attitude, living in the moment and things like that. We could be taken out at any time, but that's totally inconsistent with the pathological fear of aging, unless you're kind of looking at it from the angle of just like a exalting youth or something like that.
Could be. I also had a question. I wonder if you two had some thoughts on this. I'm sure you have plenty of thoughts. That's why I'm asking it. Here we go. With people moving around, across the country, and this kind of gets to, Jon's points with like parents growing up in New York and then being from Baltimore. If people grow up in one particular area, let's say they grow up in the South, or the Deep South, and they move to another area. Let's say they move to the left coast. How does that new culture? How would you anticipate that new culture impacting the manifestation of their OCD or the way that it presents itself?
That's a really good question.
I get one a day, so that was my one.
All right.
I think you could take it a little bit further, because I think people, some people assimilate to the surroundings and some people don't, right?
Mhm.
And that also says something about their culture, right? So one of the things that this study doesn't capture are two things. One is nations within their nation, like Orthodox Judaism or
Mhm.
populations, natives, and things like that, where there might be a carried culture through from location to location that's only just barely affected by the outside because of how much attention to survival is connected to staying the same. So if I'm working with an Orthodox Jewish person from New York and an Orthodox Jewish person from California, I'm not going to see a huge amount of difference in types of things they might be obsessing about. And the other is transplant culture. So, the left, we think of Los Angeles as being left coast, but it's actually not. We weren't sure. I remember when we did the presentation, but it's part of El Norte, right?
Yeah.
And so it's very affected by Hispanic culture, religious Catholicism, and like a sort of different aesthetic than what you get going up the coast. That said, Los Angeles itself has been so burdened by actors from New York and other people who go there seeking careers, that it has this culture within a culture as well. And you can see that even, and I know you know this, Kevin, from being in Southern California, like you could see this just driving down the coast, going from a place like West Hollywood to Huntington Beach, right? You get to see like different politics, different.
It's a little different, yeah.
Yeah. So when we think about a whole area being like this or like that, we also have to be careful if we were to zoom in, I think we would see pockets. Like I think like if you look at like Texas, we'd say Texas is like this, right? But if you're looking at Austin, it's going to look a little bit different than looking at all Texas. Yeah. But the cultures can't help but influence each other. I mean, they might not know how they're influenced, but they can't help but be influenced by it. And I think there's more to learn about how do people absorb their surroundings, even if they're trying not to, right? Like I bet if we dug deep, we would find sort of different, like kind of core differences between, let's say an Orthodox Jewish person living in Brooklyn and an Orthodox Jewish person living in Los Angeles. But they may not be fully aware of these differences. One just might eat more kosher Mexican food or something, but not really understand why.
This is a question for Jed Sieve then.
Perhaps, yeah.
So he might be able to answer that question. So,
speaking personally, I can tell you that I'm definitely like impacted by the kind of tolerance and diversity and secularism inherent in the New Netherlands culture, even though I never grew up there, just because that's where my parents are from.
Yeah. Do you think that more homogenous areas are gonna manifest differently, or we would expect it to manifest differently than in more diverse communities? So, for example, like you talked about, Los Angeles is just inundated by everybody, and it's it's hard to find a native out here, but in other places where there isn't a whole lot of migration from that area, I wonder if they'd be more inundated with that, and if OCD might be more along these lines that we're talking about, or if it's just that grab bag that, again, we can't stereotype people, as it turns out.
Yeah.
Who knows?
I think it's really interesting. And the other thing, just to sort of add to this, is something that Woodard says in his book is that, just like Jon said, even though people migrate and move around the country a lot more now than they did 300 years ago, generally speaking, people either sort of become sort of subsumed within the culture, or what probably happens more is that people are more likely to migrate to some other region that's, or some other state or whatever that's still part of their sort of like overarching nation. So like I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. I went to graduate school in Northern Illinois. I did my internship and postdoc up at Rogers in Wisconsin. That's all Yankeedom. And some of that I didn't have control over really. But I think when given the choice, people also tend to sort of, stay in areas that feel familiar to them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I know we're getting to the end of our time, and y'all are very busy people. So Is there anything that you'd want to add just at the tail end of this, either in a question for further continued research, or other questions that you'd love for this information to, or this data set to pull out? I guess what are your thoughts on this?
I think, as with any, I think a good study, it should answer one part of a question and then prompt lots of other questions. And I think a recurring sort of theme when only like scratch the surface, is looking deeper at the function kind of underlying different things. We can sort of hypothesize that we think if this is more prevalent here or less prevalent there, it's because of X, Y, and Z, but we are sort of making assumptions and not accounting for what you were just describing of people, sort of migrating somewhere else. And so, with any study, I always look back and I'm like, oh, I should have asked this, or I wish I would have asked that. I did wrestle with, should I ask people what state and county they grew up in, or should I ask them where they currently live? Because I thought asking both might just be too much, and people may not want to give all that info. And I ended up doing the latter, where you currently live, because I thought the growing up question can be really complicated for people who sort of moved around. But yeah, in terms of what is actually next for me, I can't necessarily dig into those functions that I didn't ask about. But all sorts of questions on the docket about, who within these regions are more likely to, endorse certain obsessions. Like one of the ones we didn't get a chance to get to is gender identity obsessions, which is more prevalent in the Deep South. And when I looked into that, what I found was that finding was largely driven by trans people living in the Deep South. So again, not so much cis people necessarily often being afraid that they're trans, but rather trans people living in, a sort of hostile region where the stakes are really high to get it right. And therefore sort of doubting that they've gotten it right. And so that's something I'm excited to do as an extension of this work, is to really dig in and see, what are the similarities of the people within these regions that may also sort of offer some explanation.
Yeah, I think I'm really curious to learn more about, things that challenge our assumptions, right? So we often in the OCD world talk about perfectionism as a bad thing. Being perfectionist is a problem, right? You should be less perfectionist. But some cultures' relationship to perfectionism is also very deeply connected to survival, like you were just saying, right? Mm-hmm. That it really matters to not be seen as having a weakness, or having done the wrong thing, or not being smart enough, or working hard enough, or whatever it might be. That's deeply embedded in the culture. So like what I might be calling perfectionism, is like lining things up on your desk. They might be associating with something much more profound than that. They can easily get overlooked in these conversations. So I agree. I think any good research should answer one question and then raise 10 more. And so I have a lot more questions about how can we use this to be more culturally informed and also help people to practice more self-compassion. Because I think if you have an understanding as to why these like awful, ego-dystonic, intrusive thoughts are coming after you, mm-hmm. and that understanding is somehow grounded in the inevitability of like your environment kind of makes it more likely that this is where your mind would tend to go. I think there's an opportunity there to get people to step back from the self-hatred part of OCD and focus more on like, okay, how do I change the way I'm relating to these thoughts?
Yeah. I love that. Just be able to disconnect from that narrative of what it feels like it says about you, and rather than instead reconnect to just the anxiety part of it, and how do you make space for that, rather than fighting the narrative of the OCD that may be influenced by your surroundings or your upbringing. So love that. Well, I appreciate both of you for sharing your time. For anybody out there who's listening to this, if you know someone in one of those areas in New France or, New Caribbean,
Spanish Caribbean.
That one. If you know someone from that area, or if you know someone who is willing to share their story, go check this out. Go let your voice be heard on this. Clinicians out there, put this out there, put that little QR code in your waiting room. Just try to get more information about this. The more information, the better, the better data, the better information we can pull from this. So Anyhow, I appreciate you both so much, and have a good day.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to the Fearcast. If you would like your question answered on a future episode, please click on the Submit a Question link at fearcastpodcast.com. If you would like your question answered sooner, please send me a recording of your question to questions@fearcastpodcast.com, or by sending me an audio message through Instagram by DMing me at fearcastpodcast on Instagram. If you like the Fearcast, please write a review on your podcast platform of choice. Please remember that the Fearcast is not a substitute for psychotherapy. If you need a little bit of help in your recovery, please go over to fearcastpodcast.com and click on the Find Help link, and there's going to be some information for you there. So until next time, take a risk, challenge yourself, and don't take your brain too seriously.